Welcome back, everybody, to the Wisconsin Maple Hour, UW-Madison Extension's webinar series for Wisconsin maple enthusiasts. Each program features a timely topic, guest speaker, and live Q&A. Check out the Maple Hour homepage for our recordings, including last month's webinar on Wisconsin ticks. So I'll make sure to keep those links in the chat, and we'll also link them at the bottom of the recording. So this month, I'm thrilled to welcome our guest, Professor Eric Burkhart from Pennsylvania State University, teaching professor, botanist, ethnobotanist, and agroforester to the Maple Hour to talk about non-timber forest products that can be grown and harvested in an active sugar bush, so your maple woods. We'll look at understory plants like ramps and ginseng and other forest farming crops worthy of your consideration. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, turn the floor over to Professor Burkhart. And just a reminder that throughout the presentation, we will be taking your questions in the chat. So please feel free to enter those. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to go through those and you'll have an opportunity to as well raise your questions through the microphone if you'd like at that time. So with that, welcome, Professor Burkhart. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, Tony. Thanks for having me here. Good evening, everybody out there in Zoom land. Hope you're having a good spring evening. Coming to you from, I guess, my farmstead here in central Pennsylvania. And for about the next hour or so, I'll talk to you a little bit about companion crops for the sugar bush. I'm actually going to cover a lot of thoughtful kind of planning that goes into managing a forest farm, particularly in a sugar bush. So I'll try and cover a lot of ground, but I'm not going to be able to like go through each and every crop that one might actually have. I just noticed my video's off, so there you go. Each and every crop that could be grown in a forest farm. Um, Instead, I'm just going to focus in on a variety of different things and talk a little bit about each. And one of the big contexts for this is going to be a sugar maple stand, or at least a stand that is dominated by a sugar maple component. And there's reasons for that, as we'll talk about when we talk about some of these plants and where they like to grow. So, if you're on Instagram by chance and you feel like giving me a follow, I'm at PSU Botany and Ethnobotany. I don't do much social media, but I try and keep folks updated there, especially on a lot of our research publications and so on, and some of the programming that we do. So I've been here at Penn State here for about 25 years and study non-timber forest products, as was mentioned, and do a lot in the realm of forest farming. So this evening, let me see if I can advance. Let me just remind everybody about agroforestry. So context for this is that a maple stand isn't in and of itself an agroforestry system. There are components that go into that, and I won't wax too poetically about that, but we call that the four I's here. The intentionality of things, how it's integrated together. It often involves a certain amount of intensity in terms of thinking about multiple things going on your forest land. And a lot of these things are, of course, interacting directly. And so we think about these four I's as kind of a Venn diagram with agroforestry sitting at the center of it. And agroforestry then is an intentional system where we combine woody plants with herbaceous plants. I'll also talk a little bit about mushrooms and fungi this evening, and animals, specifically if we're talking about silvopasture systems. So I'm going to hit on these four I's as we move through tonight's presentation, but this is something you certainly want to think about as we move forward. Agroforestry then in the United States and around the world consists of a set of practices. These things are not mutually exclusive, but have a lot of overlap. This evening we'll be talking about forest farming, but a lot of the principles apply to all of these systems in terms of thinking through the system and how to integrate a variety of different products and intentions. Okay? And so other practices that you may have heard about and out your way, I'm assuming most people here or all people are from Wisconsin. You have the Savannah Institute, and they tend to promote some of these other practices like alley cropping and windbreaks a little bit more intensively. I'll just note for those who are interested, either listening live or watch the recording later, that I'm working with Savannah Institute and the Wisconsin Ginseng Growers Association, WGGA, right now on a 2-day intensive program around ginseng forest farming that we're hoping to hold in July. So it'll be held sooner rather than later, but hopefully right now we're targeting a final registration page and so on for July. And that'll be focused on forest farming as a practice in Wisconsin, and ginseng specifically as a crop. And we'll be focusing on areas in Spring Green, where the Savannah Institute campus is, as well as up north in Wausau, where some of the forest farms and artificial shade operations are. So that's a little digression, but just mention that should be coming up. And so again, on Instagram, we'll be posting an update, and I'll try and share something back with Tony as well. So this practice of forest farming is quite simply, perhaps not as intense as you might think with the name farming, but we'll talk about that. It's managing a forest and thinking about multiple levels that are happening in that forest, right? So typically in timber management, we're thinking only about the tree. Maybe with maple sugaring operations, we're thinking predominantly about the tree canopy, but this is thinking about what's going on in that mid and understory layer in a forest as well. And in those layers, we can introduce or steward things that are already present, right? So stewarding means that we have some native non-timber forest products that we might be interested in. Whatever's growing on our site, we try and read the site as it is rather than converting it wholesale to something else. But we're thinking about what's growing there, what's the site capable of. And we're either managing whatever's there or we're introducing things because the site conditions look really good. And we'll talk about indicator species and so on this evening. And so we're introducing things, but it's important to note that we're typically not introducing non-native exotic species from outside the country. Yes, we're introducing things like ramps that might be coming from our neighbor's property because we don't have any, but we're not taking, an allium from China and planting that on our forest lands. And the reason for that is quite simply just the mess that invasive non-native species have created. A whole different conversation is whether they add value or not, but for now, we'll just say they can interfere with a lot of our objectives on our forest lands and overtake our forest lands. And so we want to try and focus on the native non-timber forest products that we see in our region. This is a graphic from a chapter that I wrote for the National Agroforestry Center that has been delayed, but hopefully it'll be out very soon with a guidebook listing a variety of different species that can be used in agroforestry practices. This graphic quite simply just illustrates a lot of the things that we can start thinking about, in a cartoonish way going on in our forest lands. So you can see we have D listing, with next to the bucket, our syrup that we might collect or sap that we might collect from the trees, whatever that might be. Tonight we'll be talking about primarily sugar maple, but of course red maple and black maple and other maples fit in there. And additionally, non-acer species could be tapped, right? Like birches and walnuts and so on. But we have some sort of canopy, and we're thinking about the vertical nature of that. You can see on the left side, we've got an understory, a midstory, and overstory. We're doing some silviculture. I'll come back to that to think about how we're managing that stand over the long term to encourage desirable species like sugar maple in the overstory. But we're also thinking about that midstory and understory and encouraging species compositions down there, right? Everything from herbaceous plants like ginseng to mushrooms. And these span a wide variety of realm, right? Could be medicinal, could be culinary, could be floral, whatever it is that your site grows well and that you want to, with intention manage and get more of for whatever purposes. One of the major benefits that we get from forest farming is simply the canopy that it provides, right? So agroforestry, each of the different practices has its own set of costs, benefits, and things that we're trying to accomplish. In the case of forest farming, we're trying to create a canopy or maintaining a canopy that otherwise we would need to create. And on the right side then is a artificial shade ginseng operation. I'm sure some of you have seen this in central Wisconsin. But this photo here was taken in Ontario, Canada. We'll talk a little bit about germplasm selection in forest farming towards the end, but for now, we'll just say that that canopy, when you're creating it, is very expensive, right? So creating ginseng optimum conditions in the forest understory. You've got that canopy and you're really focused on site conditions and whatever you might do to modify that site. In a field situation, you've got to create that forest canopy. And so I'll just quickly note that you might have heard of food forests as well. There's a lot of overlap in some of this terminology, but I'll just point out that when we think of forest farming, we often think that we have a forest that already exists, and we're going to do some sort of understory cropping in that forest. When we think about a food forest, we're often starting with an open scenario and we're planting trees and other vegetation that over the long term is going to create a closed canopy, right? So we're trying to create what you see on the right side here by planting woody veg that's going to create that canopy. That takes many years. You can use things like hybrid poplars and so on that maybe in 10 years you can get enough shade to grow things in, but it still takes a lot of time. So the benefit here really is that we get shade. And that shade then needs to be factored against what it is that we want to grow there. Is it something that likes to grow in the shade, or is it something that we should be growing in a field, in a food forest, or other types of agroforestry arrangements? Okay. And so on that note, as I look out the window right now at the meadow outside my house, I have a high tunnel, and this is what I see. Maybe if we rewind about a week, and those are ramps, otherwise known as wild leeks, and I have them growing in full sunlight, in a meadow, a native meadow on my homestead, right, in a northeast facing little pocket. And so I'm just pointing this out because many plants that grow on forest lands actually can grow outside of those forest lands. And it becomes a question of whether that's the most productive way and most cost effective way to grow those plants. So, for example, service berries, right, amelanchiers and pawpaws and other types of fruit that can be found on forest lands oftentimes are more productive in forest gaps, forest edges, or simply just put out in some other type of agroforestry arrangement, like an alley cropping system or something of that nature. In the case of ramps here, ramps actually photosynthesize during the time when the leaf out has not occurred, right? So there are very few leaves pushed out, or at least fully pushed out on tree canopy, and they're maximizing that sunlight that's coming down to photosynthesize and basically store energy in the bulb. They're going to senesce those leaves by the time we get to, let's say, Memorial Day weekend in much of Eastern and Midwestern North America. And yet they're not done yet. They're not a true spring ephemeral. They're going to send up a scape with flowers on it in July, and seeds will be produced in September and October. And so ramps have a very interesting phenology where they just tend to do competitively best on forest lands, but actually can grow just fine out in open conditions. And so this is a paper from Canada that was done back in the published back in the 90s, the study done in the late 80s, early 90s. And in Canada, ramps are actually a federally listed species, if we want to call it a federal government. It's not quite, but it's a federal species, if you will. It's listed and it's protected at that level. And that's because they're at the northern end of the range of the species, and much of the habitat has been converted to farming or other types of uses. And so it's not permitted to grow ramps commercially, or should I say harvest ramps commercially in the state in the country. But it is possible to actually grow them. And so they've done a lot of experiments over the years on different aspects of ramp horticulture, if you will, to demonstrate a variety of things. And one of the things I point out and highlight here, in short, is that they note that ramps can be grown in full sunlight as long as you keep abundant moisture available. So, as it turns out, ramps can grow in full sunlight, but they require, with shallow roots, a lot of moisture, right? And so we tend to find ramps in particular locations in the landscape. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along. So when we talk about forest farming, we're thinking about an existing forest or perhaps in the food forest gardening lingo, we're talking about an open condition where we're trying to create a stand. But either way, we're thinking about that canopy and the value that it provides, not as an impediment to what we're trying to do. Within forest farming, we have a continuum of practices that we can pursue. I call this the options continuum. On the left side, we can do wild stewardship, in which case we're doing a little bit more than just going out and foraging and exploiting a resource. Rather, we're getting to know that resource, the biology of it. We're taking seeds, we're dividing rhizomes, whatever we need to do to make sure that that thing continues to sustain itself, right, while we're harvesting it for whatever purposes. On the other end of the spectrum is what we call the woods cultivated scenario, where it's a lot of horticulture. It might involve tillage, it might involve pesticides of some sort, irrigation, but we're pushing that forest canopy and understory towards something that represents more of a horticultural scenario with raised beds or obvious pathways and so on. And then what I find here in operating in Pennsylvania and the region is that most people are operating somewhere in the middle of this practice where we call wild simulated production, right? Where it's managing wild stands or it's managing introduced plant material as if it's wild, right? And so it means extra seeding, augmentation of populations, removal of competitive vegetation, invasive plants, and so on, right? So it's somewhere in the middle. You pick and choose from kind of like a cafeteria of options there, right? So in tonight's presentation, I'll be talking about a variety of different kinds of jump off points in this kind of continuum. So here we have actually a picture from central Wisconsin, as it turns out. This is a forest farm raising American ginseng as a crop. Many of the trees in this stand are sugar maple, but not all of them. There's some white oak and basswood and some other things in here. But this is a scenario where this farm is a full-blown woods cultivated or woods grown scenario where you can see actually there are wheel ruts where pesticides are being applied, where tillage has been done, where beds have been made and walkways in between. And this is, about as intensive as it gets, okay? But it's very productive as far as the system goes. Okay, here is another form of a system. This is from Pennsylvania. This doesn't have quite the raised beds kind of architecture going on here, but here we have a lot of ginseng where this grower has thinned out a lot of invasive vegetation and so on in the understory and has kind of raked up the ground, left a lot of the native veg in place, but a lot of it, wasn't very desirable anyway. And so you can see much of it is American ginseng that has been kind of seeded in very intensely into this forest understory. In this case, this forest is largely red maple dominated and is leased ground actually and surrounded by farm fields. When you're pushing a plant like ginseng or many crops that would, be grown in these kinds of systems, one of the things that you're going to notice is that just like we might see in open traditional horticultural conditions, we're going to start to see pestilence. That pestilence manifests itself in native diseases and wildlife because we are growing on natural areas, right, or forest lands. And so the more intense that we get with this system, the more we're going to see some stuff pop up that's undesirable. In the case of American ginseng, the reason that we don't see a lot of people pursuing the systems I just showed you, and most people going in the wild simulated or the wild stewarded direction is because of diseases primarily. So again, some of you are probably familiar with what's going on in Wisconsin with artificial shade production of ginseng and know that one of the major issues associated with that and costs associated with that type of system is that you have to put on a lot of pesticides. Typically, every 10 days, you're putting on some type of fungicide in particular to deal with things like alternaria blight, which will move on to the foliage. Or worse yet, Phytophthora, which will actually take down the roots and turn them to mush. And when that runs through a garden or a forest farm, you're going to, just weep because years of time, money, effort, etc., is just going to go away overnight or in a few weeks. And so these diseases and more will pop up in these systems, as will some of the native wildlife that we might think is cute and otherwise desirable moving into a lot of the systems. So here, one of my arch nemesis, growing a lot of different things, including ginseng, are voles. And in particular, you get woodland voles that move in. And woodland voles can build up over time. You might be doing well for 5, 10, 15 years. I've known growers that have grown on the same site for 30 years plus. If you're growing, as I'll talk more about in a few moments, on a non-intensive basis and the diseases are not pressure like they are under more intense scenarios, you can actually recrop ginseng in the same area for generations, right? That's often something that people are astonished, especially in Wisconsin, to hear because, under artificial shade, you have to rotate after every crop. You have to find new virgin land. It cannot be cropped even within the last 100 years. But as you dial back the intensity of those populations of ginseng on forest lands and have other native plants mixed in, you run into less problems with disease, but you may still experience a lot of wildlife issues. And voles are one of them. They can actually move in after 20, 30 years. And there's probably some sort of feedback loop where when they eat the roots, just like they benefit humans and other things like lab rats, where a lot of research has been done, they probably reproduce and thrive. And there's a feedback loop where they'll just eat your garden to death, so to speak. Okay. Now, one of the ways that we kind of counter that is by making sure that we're not pushing populations and that we're mixing those populations up. So this is an intercropping here of golden seal and ginseng. Both of these crops will grow in sugarbush understories. I'll talk more about site indicators again as we move through, but these can be intermixed. They're often considered indicators for one another in many parts of the range, including out through the Midwest. And so the thing that golden seal gets you is it's often a considered a very bitter rhizome as well as top. And oftentimes people will mix in the rhizomes with ginseng because the voles will be deterred by those bitter rhizomes that are encountered, right? So as they're burrowing their tunnels through, they'll hit some ginseng pockets, sure, but they'll hit some golden seal and they'll be deterred and go away, right? So it doesn't hurt, but it means that you've got to plan ahead. You've got to mix these things together, right? One other quick thing I'll note is remember I just mentioned that diseases are an issue in ginseng. This was a study that just wrapped up that I was a collaborator on with the International Ginseng Institute out of Middle Tennessee State University, led by Ying Gao. And what Ying did was go to some of our growers' farms here in the Mid-Atlantic region and collect some of the disease material. And they isolated some new pathogens, as it turns out. And one of the things that they did with these new pathogens and old pathogens is they tested these extracts of golden seal root against them in what we would call lab conditions. And we found really good suppression of diseases by golden seal aqueous extracts, right? So ethanol obviously has an alcohol fraction, but this was also including, just water, basically. And so, short story is this is a lab, but you can imagine then that when these rhizomes and the foliage are in these ginseng gardens and decomposing and doing their thing mixed in with ginseng, that they are suppressing the fungal pathogens as well. And so, one of the things that you've probably heard about in just horticulture in general is that monocultures will attract a lot of pestilence, right? And so diseases, wildlife of one sort or another is an issue. Polycultures, mixing things in diverse ways and strategic ways. Remember the I intentionality and remember the I interaction in strategic ways can actually be beneficial. So what we typically encourage people to do, as we would with a sugar bush, right? You don't want to convert your entire forest canopy composition to sugar maple. From a productivity standpoint, that sounds nice, but we like to keep a little bit of variety in there, right? For forest health, for resilience, right? For resistance to pest pathogens and so on. Same thing is true in the understory. We don't want to convert the entire understory to ginseng. We just want to kind of bump up the numbers of plants that we see in that understory, right? And get them reproducing so that we've got our own established populations that we can manage and harvest from. And so typically we're thinking about companion planting, which is what I just shared with golden seal. Or if you're just working with your existing forest land, you're just maintaining those polycultures, that diverse mix of understory species that you find desirable. That means that you're subtracting the things that you don't want, the garlic mustard and the honeysuckles and the multiflora roses, and you're letting the things that you want fill in, and you might be adding to those things over time, right? Bringing in some additional ramps from a property adjacent because you don't have any, etc. Okay, in the overstory, you're thinking about that species composition and making some decisions that favor, in this case, sugar maples, right? And so when we think about a sugar maple, this is just a very simple diagram, and I won't stay on it forever. But on the left side, when we initiate a stand, notice species A is in there. That might be your black cherry or your hawthorns or something that's early successional that as that forest develops is going to go away, largely because of the competition that is created and the shade that follows, right? So we think of things that are that are coming up as early pioneers or early successional species as often being fast growing and shade intolerant species. And then later, as that stand starts to mature and competition really kicks in with more shade tolerant species, it starts to thin out. Species diversity maybe starts to do some interesting things. So you notice that species C, for example, that's in that stand initiation stage, is not dominant until later stages when it's released, either by us, right, doing timber stand improvements, or by nature creating gaps, right? So white ash, which I'll talk about in a moment, being killed off by emerald ash borer creates a gap, co-occurred with sugar maple, and now sugar maple, because of its shade tolerance, is able to reach up through that gap and become a co-dominant in that canopy, right? So we're managing this in the overstory, and we're managing it in the understory. That is the essence of forest farming. Okay, so we start with whatever forest conditions we have. In this case, you can see this is a early to early mid-successional stand where the tree composition is quite frankly not very desirable. And you can see low quality cherry here on the left side. And we're going to start to think about where we want that forest to go in the overstory, make some decisions about cutting trees, and we're going to start to think about where it's going in the understory and start seeding in or managing populations and subtracting things that we don't want. We're paying attention. You can see there's some blackberry in here. Blackberry will fade out when we start to get canopy closure, right? So native species that are going to fade out over succession, we're not too concerned about. We're just going to enjoy them while they're there. Okay, we do have many forests. I know in Wisconsin from being out there the last few years for different field days and work, field work and so on, as well as here in Pennsylvania where this picture was shot, that we often are inheriting what we call land use legacy that contains a lot of invasive shrubs or plants in the understory that we're going to have to do something about if we want to do introductions of ginseng. In this particular scenario, not exactly this picture, but in this particular scenario, not too far away, I'll just point out to you that I have successfully introduced American ginseng into a barberry thicket like this, allowed for that ginseng to establish for 5 or 6 years, and then gone in and cut out all of that overstory and treated the stumps and had success with kind of getting ginseng along while deterring people and deer from browsing on it. So think about it as a successional pathway that you can manage, and invasive shrubs in some cases can be useful for a certain period of time, but ultimately usually get subtracted, right? So let's talk about fungi in this system. So I was just talking with Tony, and Tony said he found his first morel. So many of you are probably fans of mushroom hunting and foraging, and maybe some of you grow shiitakes on logs and so on. I just want to touch on this because there's a lot that we can do in this process to encourage our friends in the fungal kingdom as well, including in sugar bushes. So some of the trees that are typically associated with things like morels include historically white ash, right? And green ash. These days, maybe a little more black ash in northern Wisconsin. But oftentimes we're looking at the jump that they've made over to other species as ash has declined in much of the range. So here in Pennsylvania, for example, I've been finding them this year pretty successfully under tulip poplars, right? We can find them on white pines quite a bit, sometimes red pines, sometimes sycamores. So I say all of that because we're going to start to think about the species that are on our property that might be playing host to morel mushrooms if we're interested in wild mushrooms. So we think about morels as an example of how we do this. We've got different species. I won't get into the taxonomy, but here's some of the blondes, as they call them, or the yellows, as well as the blacks on the right side. These may have a slightly different ecology in your area, on your forest lands, in terms of where you find them and where they show up. So, for example, here in central Pennsylvania, one of our best locations to find the yellows or the gray phase yellows would be elm stands, which tend to be limestone dominated. Mixed in with that elm is quite commonly either tulip poplar and or sugar maple and historically white ash. And here's our tulip poplar showing up. And so how this works is thinking about your sugar bush, your forest lands, where the mushrooms are showing up that you're interested in, whether they be morels, chanterelles, black trumpets, on down the line. We need to think about their ecology on the forest lands. And so in the case of morels, morels can perform as saprobic mushrooms, meaning that they're going to decompose litter, right? So their mycelium below ground, what you're looking at here is the fruiting body, is found on organic matter that is rotting away. And they're hastening that process and taking the nutrients, and they're using those nutrients to produce reproductive fruiting bodies, like you see here. Um, but morels often are what we would call ectomycorrhizal. They actually grow in partnership with certain tree species. And I'm not saying sugar maple is a species, but I am saying that sugar maple dominated stands are a favorite haunt of morel mushrooms, at least the yellows. So again, looking around some of those co-associated species, the elms, the tulip poplars, the white pines, and so on, we can find that a lot of these things like a basic soil, calcium-rich soil, and morels are no exception to that. How does this work then? Notice that this fruiting body looks terrible. And I'm showing this because we want to pay attention to where the morels are showing up, where the chanterelles are showing up, and we want to leave some behind. We want to move them around a little bit. We want to seed them into our forest lands. One of the best ways to do that is to take the morels that are a little too far gone or otherwise inedible, like this one was encountered just a little too late. And this is still going to shed spores. It is probably shedding some spores as we look at this picture. Take this seed piece, if you will, and seed it in to your forest land around some of these host trees. Okay. And one of the other things then we can do, you can see this is a ramp site that is dominated by sugar maple. The ash was cut out prior to declining because this site had not yet experienced emerald ash borer. And one of the decisions that this landowner made was not only to remove the ash, but to retain a good percentage of the canopy that he needs for the ramps to not have too much sunlight exposure. Remember that they can tolerate sunlight, but they'll get a lot of competition if we open it up too much, and they don't tolerate competition. And so he was playing for the ramps in this case, but also leaving trees in like elms for the morels that he has on this property. And so taking those morel fruiting bodies, spreading them around, setting them next to trees that might make good host trees as part of overstory management. A lot of the biomass leaving a lot of these stands through timber stand improvement, through selection of trees that we want to keep, whether they're sugar maples or mushroom trees, those culls, if you will, we can take that biomass and we can use that to raise other types of mushrooms, right? So let's not forget about things like shiitake mushrooms, which we can use and rear them on forest lands in our understory. So we're not taking our most desirable trees, we're taking some of the cull, but we're not taking the dead and dying stuff either. It's a whole other topic on raising mushrooms, but in short, we want to select nice logs, but of species that are overtopped, that are diseased and dying, and things that are otherwise somewhat healthy that we can utilize. We don't want competitive mushrooms in there. And then we're going to put those logs typically in our stand. Now, in all of this, site selection is extremely important. So, in the questions that I saw leading up to this webinar, there was a lot of questions about a variety of different species. And I could run down like 10, 12, 50 slides of like, this is this species, and this is the kind of pH that you might be considering, and the soil conditions and wetness and so on. But what I'm going to do is encourage you in other way, otherwise to think about it more broadly. Think about it for yourself. A lot of forest farming is simply observation coupled with seeking knowledge, right? And so in this process of forest farming, site selection is extremely important. And fortunately, as people who are operating sugar maple stands, you're probably used to reading where trees grow and where they don't grow. Trees are a long-term barometer of site conditions, especially of deep soil conditions like parent materials and moisture, right? And they're also a good barometer of kind of how dry the site is or moist it is and those types of things. So in site selection, we're going to pay attention to species that we're interested in and where they tend to grow. We're going to introduce or manage them in the site conditions that seem to favor their growth. We have published, and I've asked Tony to push out some papers, at least towards the end, a couple of examples of studies where we've looked at site conditions for things like ramps and ginseng and come up with which trees and which soil conditions you want to be looking at. So you can find some of this stuff, and even through AI, probably it'll call some of those papers and stuff like that. But the bottom line is you're learning to be a forest ecologist of sorts. You got to figure out where these things grow through observation and then match those conditions or move that material around on your property to those site conditions which it seems to match, but the species is not there for whatever reason, right? So earlier I mentioned land use legacy. That might be because it was cleared for agriculture 100 years ago, or it was grazed, right? A lot of our really heavily infested invasive sites are because it was grazed by livestock 100 years ago. So there is no diversity there. But you're looking at the overstory and you're saying, boy, there's a lot of nice sugar maples here and tulip poplars mixed in, and this is a north and east facing slope, and it never really dries out completely bone dry. These are the things that you're kind of fitting together to form kind of a sense of what do I want to grow and where do I want to grow it, right? So what does this get you? Um, you're not going to have to modify that site extensively just by subtracting invasive shrubs and so on. So we're not talking about, testing the soil endlessly and adding limestone or sulfur for acidifier. We're saying match it to the local site conditions, right? Site selection is going to reduce your startup costs and your overhead because you're not really investing in anything except for the management of that timber resource. And good site selection is going to reduce the issues that we see with things like diseases and pestilence. It's going to make those crops grow much more quickly, be much more reproductive, fruitful, so that we can get seeds and things that we can start planting back in a shorter amount of time. Okay, and so let me talk a little bit in the remaining time about American ginseng. I'm just going to dial in on this species and talk about how we start to piece some of this stuff together into a cohesive strategy. Now, I'll just start by saying I picked American ginseng because it is the most lucrative of the forest farming crops that we have in the Midwest and Eastern United States, with prices for wild appearing material anywhere from $700 to about $1,500 a pound in recent years. So it's a very promising crop. It's been advocated for at least 100 years. I've been working on the species for about 25 years. And we have a slow but steady forest farming industry that's building up, including support groups for people who are interested in this. It's also an interesting crop because one of the major species it's found in association with is sugar maple. So we look for sugar maple dominated stands. Again, they can have elms and tulip poplars and basswoods and historically white ashes and stuff, but sugar maple really is the key species here that we're looking for when we think about American ginseng. It likes the nice, cool, moist conditions, not too moist, mind you, but moist enough. And it also has that interactive effect that we were looking for, whereby the calcium that's sequestered by sugar maple in its leaves actually is deposited on an annual basis on the top of the soil, right? So it's basically pooling up calcium from the bedrock and parent materials. And ginseng likes calcium, and I'll talk more about that. So American ginseng is cultivated under artificial shade, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is from Ontario, Canada, where it's also grown. So you've got central Wisconsin and then across the lakes there in Ontario, where this crop is grown under artificial shade. It's been grown under this type of system for a long time, but one of the strengths of American ginseng is it's got a very niche market that is primarily in China and Korea. And so it's got a pretty foolproof marketplace as well when it comes to forest grown material. As long as you grow it so that it looks wild and it's got some age, there's no problem selling it. Unfortunately, in both Wisconsin and Canada, the market for artificial shade ginseng right now is in a lull. And a lot of the growers are suffering, including the industry in Wisconsin. And so this is not something I would advocate people get into at the moment. If you are interested in shade grown ginseng, you should go up and talk to the WGGA folks. Instead, the future of American ginseng in many regards throughout much of Midwestern and Eastern North America is going to be on forest lands, as you see here, as a wild simulated crop where it is seeded into sugar maple stands. That's a sugar maple tree on the right side that you're looking at. And that is going to be managed as if it's a wild crop with a lot of patience until at least year 10 when it can be harvested and sold as a wild appearing product, fetching those nice prices that I just mentioned. Okay, American ginseng is again mostly sold overseas, especially the wild appearing stuff, and so the prices are really much more favorable for forest farmers of this particular commodity, particularly on sugar maple stands because of this nice tight arrangement that sugar maple and ginseng have. One thing I have to caution you about, however, and I'm sure that many of you who are engaged in sap production and syrup production can appreciate this. It might sound like $40 or $50 for a gallon of finished syrup is a lot, but when you break it all down, it's not, right? It's you're making money, but you're not like raking in gold here. So in the case of ginseng, when we do the math, most of the data, including in states like Pennsylvania, point to the fact that you're looking at about 200 roots per pound dry on forest lands when you harvest ginseng. The minimum is going to be 5 years till you can harvest it, and most people don't sell it or buy it until that gets to about 10 years, right? So if you're looking at $1,000 per pound, that sounds really great. You have to break it down, and we're really thinking about $5 per plant over the long term, right? So these are nursery prices, if you want to put it in that context, as if you're raising perennial native plants in a nursery for 5 or 10 years, and then you're going to get some value add out of it. So even selling it overseas to some of these markets isn't maybe as lucrative as you might think it is. And many people have been increasingly turning to domestic markets, which I don't have a whole, I don't have time to really talk about. But we have been building out in the United States markets, for example, for the leaf, which can be harvested after about year 3 to build in a little bit of annual income and so on. And keep in mind as well that once you have an established population of ginseng on your property and you're managing it and getting seeds from it, it becomes more of a circular crop cycle where you can harvest each and every year. So you're not really thinking about it just like with maple as, I plant in year one and then I start tapping these trees 100 years from now. It becomes more of kind of a management of that sugar bush through generations. And so it has become in ginseng. It's a shorter generation when we're managing ginseng, but it's still the same idea that once established, you can indefinitely harvest ginseng as long as you don't invite those diseases in. So the idea with ginseng is that as it becomes increasingly scarce and as the price continues to go up, forest farming becomes a conservation mechanism as well for the species. And it's going to be probably one of the major ways that ginseng originates from North America if I had a crystal ball and look ahead in 20 years or so. Okay, and so in that context, as I mentioned, identification is really important. This is a paper that published from work that I did almost 20 years ago at this point here in Pennsylvania, where we were looking at sites that have high calcium content and then looking at what are the indicator species that tend to show those sites in a state like Pennsylvania. In this paper, again, I've given Tony a link to it that you can access at the end here. You'll see there's list of species, and our top indicators were white ash at this point, but white ash has been all but eradicated from Pennsylvania. And so at this point, we use sugar maple, which is our number two species. Now, there's two other species that I list here that are found in the understory. One is jack in the pulpit, and the other is rattlesnake fern. And the way that you want to think about this is that it's more than just kind of looking at the soil conditions per se. Here is a soil sample that was drawn from a forest farm in east or western Pennsylvania where the grower was largely successful but had a problematic area. And this is the picture of the plant that I took. And he's like, "What's wrong with this plant?" And I said, "I don't know. Let me take a soil sample right next to the root and we'll analyze it." And this is the results we got. pH was a little low, calcium a little low, yes, but that's not the important point I want to make. The important point is that I went a mere 2 or 3 feet away and found a healthy plant. This is a picture of that, and sampled the soil. And you can see that the soil conditions are virtually identical. On the acidic side, not a whole lot of calcium, moderate phosphate, very low potash and magnesium, blah, blah, blah. They essentially look the same from a soil sampling standpoint, but the plants were experiencing two different things. And so when we get into the forest, we get into a variety of what we would call heterogeneous conditions. It's not a farm field. There's old logs that are rotten and laying down in one section. There's stones that are laying near the surface in another, right? There's a lot of different situations going on in a forest understory that makes standard horticultural agronomic practices like going out and collecting soil samples not the most cost-effective thing, especially if you have to pay for them. So we use these site indicators to tell us what's going on as more reliable sources, barometers of what's going on forest lands, right? And this is essentially what you want to think about. So I had mentioned jack in the pulpit and sang fern. And then as we look at the overstory, things like white ash, I've got basswood pictured here. It's not about one species or another that you want to get fixated on, including sugar maple. It's about the associations and where they overlap. So you're looking for those areas where you've got a strong sugar maple component, you've got that white ash, you've got, basswood, you got tulip poplar perhaps. But in addition to that, you're looking in the understory and looking for those indicator plants like an Indian turnip or a sang fern. And where those things overlap, that's your bullseye. That's telling you that the overstory and understory conditions are aligned, right? And they're telling you that the soil conditions are probably favorable, whether it's for moisture or calcium content, for introducing or managing that species if it's not already there. Okay, and so we look at sugar maple as our number one species in the state of Pennsylvania at this time in history, and it's largely a function of the leaf litter, as well as it being an indicator of the right soil moisture conditions, right? And so in a sugar bush, right? We can tap the maples, of course. Many of you are probably already engaged in this. And what makes it nice is that we're tapping that sugar bush at a time of year where the ginseng is not up at all. So we're, whatever foot traffic is going on in, if we're using a bucket operation, is not going to be a problem. We're in there and we're doing our thing during the tapping season. And by the time it comes time to harvest ginseng in late summer, this is not an issue. So again, we're thinking about how these things interact favorably together. In this case, it's our labor division. If we are concerned, we can set up tubing operations, as was done in this sugar bush and ginseng operation, where ginseng is being grown in the understory, mixed in again in this polyculture with other native desirable species, including future sugar maples, right? So we have small diameter trees that are being selected and managed for in the understory of sugar maple. And in this case, it's not really too much of a concern of foot traffic, but in much of Pennsylvania, a lot of our sugar bushes are very difficult to access. And so we can plant our ginseng in there and get it in late summer, but during the sugaring season, there's ice and snow all over those slopes, and so we got to get it off one way or another. So tubing and/or bucket operations fit in very nicely with ginseng because ginseng grows in sugar bushes and because the seasons don't overlap in terms of what needs to be done. Okay, as I mentioned, white ash, a very favorable tree historically. Unfortunately, all but eradicated from our due to emerald ash borer. And so I'm pretty sure in Wisconsin, this has been the scenario as well. Up in the central Wisconsin, I've been out there several times, including visiting the Menominee Nation. And I think they still have some pretty healthy ash on the res, but not necessarily south of there. Nonetheless, this was a big source of our morels, as I mentioned earlier. And so with the loss of this, we're looking at maintaining things like tulip poplar in our stands where we have sugar maple domination so that we can get more morels and morel habitat. Okay, other trees include basswood, tulip poplar, as I mentioned. Okay, and I mention this in the case of ginseng because, again, if calcium is of interest, well, here's a paper from 1941 where they ashed a lot of these leaves, and you can see some of the major things that they found is high calcium content in the basswood, in the tulip poplar, in the white ash, in the sugar maple, right? All of these species, whenever their leaves fall down and lay on the ground, fertilize the ginseng and create the perfect duff and environment for the plant to grow in. And this is that feedback, that interaction, right? That integration, the other eye that we're looking for in this system. This is why sugar maple and ginseng do so well. I'll also point out that our indicator species for ramps also overlap with this list and include that third species that's on the list, which isn't squared out here, bitternut hickory. Because ramps tend to grow in slightly moister habitats in many locations, not all, we often see a good component of bitternut hickory in our stands. And so, we're matching up the species overstory in that case with a little bit higher moisture requirement on the part of ramps. And so this is a ginseng grower managing the overstory. And let me just put this piece together for you. Not only is it about the duff breaking down and releasing that calcium to the ginseng plants, but this is a ginseng grower's operation. And you look at this and you say, well, that doesn't look a whole lot like a farm. Well, that's by design for a variety of reasons. So first of all, ginseng is an extremely valuable plant, and we don't want people to steal it. And so we've got to think about visibility issues in many cases, right? So we don't want it to stick out like a sore thumb. The second piece to this is a grower that's trying to grow ginseng that looks wild. To get that, he's trying to manage this stand as if it's a wild stand. So you can see that tree on the right was cut. So this was a crop tree selection decision where the tree on the left was favored. The one on the right had to go. But notice that that top material, in this case, was laid down, and then ginseng was seeded into these gaps that were created. Okay, now that material is going to hide the ginseng a little bit, but it's also going to protect it from things like deer and turkey. And as that ginseng crop then grows up in all of that slash material, we're getting some protection as if it's a chicken wire fence or something like that, but without the visibility. we're also then over time getting that material breaking down and fertilizing and creating organic matter, which is of course important not just to the ginseng crop, but to the overstory trees, including sugar maple as well. So we're trying to cycle that fertility back to that soil as well as the organic matter. This is going to protect us, as I mentioned, from things like white-tailed deer, which can be a real problem in ginseng stands. Interestingly, we have a paper that's coming out where we studied populations across Pennsylvania of ramps, and we didn't see any sign that ramps are browsed by deer. We back that up then by turning to the horticultural literature and find that a lot of deer-resistant cultivars of alliums are advised for people who have deer problems in their yards. So it seems that things like ramps can be grown where you just can't do anything about the deer. But in the case of ginseng, which is a preferred species, but not the most preferred, okay, you can protect those plants a little bit by keeping that duff on the ground as well as that biomass. And by the way, that biomass, such as the twigs and branches, doesn't have to come just during timber stand improvement operations, but during blowdowns or anything that falls out of the canopy, right? You can just manipulate that material in the understory and use it however you need to use it. And so in providing that cover, you can see ginseng here is reproducing. We can gather those seeds, we can take them to new areas, we can seed them in. It's protected from the deer in this case. And we've got some other biodiversity in there. In this case, I don't like everything I see. There's quite a few invasives coming up in there. But nonetheless, we're maintaining some sort of polyculture in here as well. Okay, and then what about those seeds? So we encourage people to, again, start on that left side of the continuum that I started with early in the presentation and say that if you've got any of these non-timber forest products on your property, just like with a sugar bush, you should be trying to manage for the regeneration of those first and foremost. So, whether it's ramps or ginseng or something else, golden seal, etc., if that's already present on your property, you should be collecting that material, getting to know the biology of it, and spreading it around to encourage it. Much of forest farming is just a little TLC, right? Tender loving care of these species to encourage their seeds get into the soil and that, things don't browse them off and so on. And so in the case of American ginseng, I'm showing the seeds here because the seeds of that plant material that come from the property are sorely needed at this point in history to produce the next generation of ginseng. Much of the ginseng that is coming into forest farming is coming from places like the shade gardens of Wisconsin and Ontario. And I'm not here to knock that. We actually have been doing this for a long time, at least 50 years, and maybe as long as 100 years, which is when the Wisconsin industry started, and an industry started here in Pennsylvania and my region. That industry died out here, but did not there. And one of the things we need to think about is that American ginseng as a native species is found only in the Midwest and Eastern United States. For future purposes, we have to retain as much genetic diversity and locally adapted material as possible. So where does the planting stock come from when we talk about these non-timber forest products that you're growing in a sugar bush? It should come from the site or from the region. This is where a lot of the communities that are developing around forest farming and agroforestry are important. If you want to find somebody in Wisconsin, for example, that has ramps on their property and has abundant ramps that can either sell you material or swap you material, that's what communities are for increasingly. That's what social media, in my opinion, does best. So I would encourage you to think about that. In the meantime, if you've got some of this plant material on your property, we encourage you to plant it back. Not because the plant material coming from shade gardens in Wisconsin is bad to plant on forest lands, but with each generation is becoming further and further kind of disassociated with forested conditions, right? And so this is a paper that just came out that's open access. Again, I gave it to Tony. He can push it out through the chat when I take a few questions if people are interested in reading about some of this trade. And on the right side is a practical guide to saving seeds that we created that's well illustrated, got lots of pictures, and talks about some of the basic steps associated with collecting your own ginseng seeds, planting them, and getting your own patch expansion going on forest lands. Okay, final thing I'll just say is I just mentioned the importance of community a moment ago. I don't expect that many of you that are tuning in from the Midwest might want to drive out in early June to participate in this two-day event. But I just mentioned earlier in the presentation, we are arranging a two-day event for ginseng in Wisconsin for July. Hopefully that's going to happen. And this is an event coming up in June that I'm co-hosting where we'll be going to some of the research gardens that I manage, and we'll talk about things like site identification and identification of some of these non-timber forest products and so on. So I just want to point out that there are lots of growing agroforestry and forest farming opportunities that are coming up. I can't possibly cover everything you need to know in a presentation like this and still keep you awake. And so I've hit some big points, and I just want to end by saying that, community is increasingly important. I would say it's always been important, but especially as forest farming grows and people are looking for material and for experience and to connect with other people who are doing agroforestry and forest farming, definitely look around. You'll find in your neck of the woods, I've already mentioned Savannah Institute. There's also a Midwestern Forest Farming Coalition out your way. And we have an American Forest Farming Coalition, all of which can be found on the interweb. And so with that, I'll just end. Again, I'm on social media if anybody wants to connect there, and I tend not to spam it with too much aside from research and extension opportunities. And there's my website if anybody's looking to see some of the research that we've been publishing on, not just on ginseng and ramps, but we do a lot of work with ghost pipe and several other species, including, and I'll end with this thought because this came in with a question that I received ahead of time, prickly ash. So we study prickly ash. I know that's kind of like a controversial topic in parts of Wisconsin, but prickly ash, Xanthoxylum americanum, is actually a very useful tree. And we've got a number of studies going on to look at the use of the capsule walls as well as the leaves and the bark. And in short, I'll just say that the capsule walls are a good analog for Szechuan peppercorns, which is found in the same genus, but in China. The leaves make an excellent substitute for things like curry leaf. And finally, we're kicking off some research looking at some of the compounds that have been found in Xanthoxylum, which is the genus, not only in the United States, but around the world, have actually been proving useful for blood parasites, things that are introduced by tick-borne illnesses. And so I've suffered from things like Babesia for many years, which is a protozoan parasite, blood parasite. And some of the compounds found in Xanthoxylum actually are showing to be very effective at things like control of parasites like malaria. So we're just kicking off a lot of research to just really get to know a lot of these forest farm products. And I would say to answer the question that somebody sent in at the, prior to this about should I cut out all my prickly ash? I would say, well, that's driven by your personal objectives, but just keep in mind that prickly ash is a native species, and we're just now starting to tap into its potential benefits and use in agroforestry systems moving forward. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Tony.
All right. Thank you, Professor Burkhart. That was a really fascinating presentation and really just the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, you're a real wealth of information and we appreciate you coming on the program to kind of set the framework for how we can be thinking about some of these crops and then outline a couple of those opportunities. So I just want to take a minute before we do the Q&A to just ask all the participants. If you got questions, you can enter them right in the chat. Feel free at this point. We got a pretty small crowd. You can unmute yourself and ask that question straight to Professor Burkhart. Otherwise, I wanted to just reiterate that the links that were mentioned are in the chat right now. I am going to send out an email after the program tonight. It'll probably be tomorrow or the day after with all the links from the chat that were shared during the recording. And then it'll also have a link to the actual recording. So with that, I've got a couple of questions, and I guess the first one, we talked a little bit about site selection and kind of noticed a variety of understory conditions in some of the pictures that you showed. So, how do you like to kind of talk about site preparation in terms of, in Wisconsin, we're dealing with a lot of invasives like honeysuckle and buckthorn that are really changing the characteristics of that understory community, but there's other, kind of competition in general. But how would you recommend if people think they've got a good site to think about that site preparation?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So I'll just first of all refer back to what I said, which is there's a whole continuum of practice, as we say, that you might want to jump in on. And basically, you just need to consider like what it is you want to do. So if you want to do woods cultivated, then you're going to take out a whole lot of stuff, probably some native things as well. I will just point out a lot of people will tend to leave woods cultivated kinds of practices to those forest lands that are most let's call it quote unquote degraded. So maybe have been grazed in the recent past or heavily invaded in the understory with invasive shrubs. Those might be the better sites to heavily manipulate, right? Versus some of your more pristine areas and just working with the native diversity that's already present on those localized conditions. So, depending on how much land you have, and the diversity of historic land uses and topography and forest types, this could be a lifelong and beyond kind of endeavor to get out there and get to know each and every pocket of your forest land and start to dissect it and really figure out what you want to do and where. And I know that seems daunting. That can be kind of like another I that I didn't mention. I'll just add to it, intimidating, right? So intimidating to try and figure out. But this should be something that is of interest to you. So it's something that you get to know your forest lands, you get to know them very well, you get to know them from a silvicultural standpoint, but also reading the understory conditions, figuring out those little sweet spots that are harboring species of interest and areas that you may need to modify more heavily in order to do something productive, like introduce ginseng or ramps or what have you. So there's no real cookie cutter answer to the question that Tony raised, except to say, it is a process of discovery. I call forest farming, in a positive way, a gateway drug, meaning that it really provides an introduction, a kind of draw to like really getting to know the forest lands and all of the things that occur there. So, for me, growing up in Western Pennsylvania as a little kid running around forest lands, it's been and continues to be a joy to just continue to discover all of the stuff that we're finding out about these native plants that occur on our forest lands, and stuff that's been tucked away maybe in a publication from the 1950s and stuff that we're doing research on right now. So, get in, dig in, roll up your sleeves, dig in. But final thing I'll say is think about compartments, right? So it's often a useful concept in agroforestry, but thinking about different lays of the land, different stand types, areas that are wet versus areas that are upslope. Think about how you can divide these things into smaller compartments that have their own kind of characteristics that need to be considered individually versus, as a whole practice. Like I'm just going to do the same thing everywhere. It's really about, rolling your sleeves up on microsites. Microsite could be a 10 by a 10-foot square, or it could be an acre by acre. But, you don't have to like convert an entire forest, 200 acres, to a forest farm overnight. You just have to find interesting spots that are worth rolling your sleeves up and digging in.
A great answer. And we got another question in just briefly before we conclude the program here. The question is about exotic earthworms and any issues with those. So obviously here in Wisconsin, after post glaciation, we didn't have earthworms in the landscape on most of the state, and now they're invasive species in forested ecosystems. But how do you think about that?
Yeah, so that is a real thing. It's interesting. I think you all who are dealing with maybe a little bit more northern latitudes, this is being discussed more because we don't hear a lot of it being discussed here in the mid-Atlantic. But it seems like every time I hear from people from the Midwest, especially upper Midwest, this is on their mind. Because I think as the ground is cooling off, my understanding is that a lot of invasive earthworms are migrating more and more northwards. As they're doing that, of course, for people who are not aware of this issue, they're rapidly changing the litter layer and the nutrient cycling that occurs in forest understories. So I mentioned in my presentation the importance of sugar maple leaf litter to ginseng in the understory. What a lot of these exotic earthworms in particular are doing is just rapidly converting that leaf litter to nutrients. So you're not getting a buildup of leaf litter. That leaf litter then is very important for a variety of things in the forest understory, including things like ginseng to have a nice insulation blanket over it during the winter, right? So invasive worms are changing the conditions of our forest understories here in Pennsylvania in the mid-Atlantic and our more urban areas towards like Philadelphia. Some of those big parks, you don't even see any litter on the forest understory. And many of those parks are dominated by things like tulip poplar and sugar maple. So it is absolutely something to think about. I don't know what the answer is right now, because it's such a are you going to take some sort of insecticide out and pour it all over your forest lands? I doubt it. I think we're just learning to adapt to the changing conditions, and I don't have a ready answer for like invasive earthworms and what they might be doing to our forest understories, except to say it's changing, right? I won't even say it's good or bad, but it seems like it's not a good thing with losing a leaf litter, especially for things like herps and things that might be hanging out in that leaf litter. But we don't know what the consequence is for many plants like ginseng at this point, frankly. It just seems like it's not a good trajectory.
So, in closing, we got one question here, but I think we'll just kind of wrap this up in a kind of a closing comment. It's around kind of the way that you mentioned. If you've got populations of these plants to really, get interested, start stewarding those populations, help them to thrive on your land. But if we don't have those species already on our properties, that's for each individual species. There's obviously going to be a lot of different things that we need to know. But maybe we could just talk about some resources or books or things. We shared a couple of organizations. I really like if you can see this, I have to turn off my blur here. It's the from the United Plant Savers, the Forest Farmers Handbook, as kind of a good introductory resource that covers a lot of these forest farming crops and gives 20 pages on each, and I think provides the kind of detail that you would need to get out in the woods and actually experiment a little bit. There's a lot of really good fact sheets from different extension organizations, including Penn State. But what resources would you recommend to somebody who's kind of got that interest and wants to take the next step based on what we learned tonight?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's increasingly a lot of resources. What I would personally say is I'm a bit skeptical of the AI generated resources that I see popping up increasingly because they're scraping information sources that maybe aren't the most trustworthy, right? So there's no real balancing of some of the information that comes. I notice a lot of stuff coming from blogs that may or may not be accurate that makes its way into some of this stuff. So I would say just be careful about the AI. Try and get those resources. I'm not promoting universities per se, but there are a lot of extension resources. United Plant Savers was just mentioned as a resource. My colleague Janine Davis and Scott Persons from North Carolina produced a book about 12 years ago that's widely considered to be the Bible, if you will, growing ginseng, golden seal, and other woodland plants. That's still in publication, so that's a good resource. Um, and as was mentioned, there are increasing resources coming out to fill in niches. So I mentioned that seed planting, ginseng seed planting guide that we put out. That was just something that, was a niche that we didn't see a whole lot out there. So there's increasingly information coming out there, and much of it is freely available. Just pay attention to the source of it. And I'm not telling you to prioritize university over individuals. There are a lot of individuals working in the permaculture realm and agroforestry realm that are extremely knowledgeable, but just pay attention to some of the knowledge that's coming out. In terms of plant material, I'll just quickly note that's one of the big bottlenecks that we're dealing with. with agroforestry in general in North America right now, including many of the woody plant species that are being used. In fact, that's something that Savannah Institute is working on a lot of with shrubs like hazelnuts and overstory trees like persimmons to meet that deficiency. When it comes to understory plants, you search on the web, but what I would encourage you to think about is some of these communities that I just mentioned, the forest farming communities, because increasingly this is recognized as a deficiency, and people are connecting with one another to trade or sell one another at a cheap price plant material within regions, right? So that's absolutely something that is being facilitated right now, increasingly, and will continue to be facilitated. And the final thing I'll mention then is we talked a lot about ginseng. We talked a lot about ginseng industry in Wisconsin. They produce a tremendous amount of seed that I still recommend to many forest farmers looking to get into ginseng because that seed is widely available. It's high quality. It's at an affordable price point, oftentimes less than $100 for 7,000 seeds or so. And we're studying the genetics of that material right now, and I can just say that it is still American ginseng, right? There's nothing that leads us to believe that you shouldn't be planting that material. We just need to diversify the genetics of the material that we're planting. So it's not to dissuade you from buying, especially if you're in Wisconsin, Wisconsin grown artificial ginseng seed.